All right, and we are off and running on our podcaster roundtable. Very excited to be joined by Canadian history podcasters from across the country. Let's start out west with David Borys, the host of Cool Canadian History. He's been on the show before to talk about his personal research. Then we move east. We got Craig Baird in Edmonton, the host of Canadian History X. And then Kathy Kenzora joining us from Toronto, host of History of the 90s. Very excited that all of you could join me today. Thank you so much for being here. Looking forward to chatting about each of your respective shows. So let's get right into that, and we'll go in the order I did the intros. Just the thing that I'm most curious about for people who start podcasts now or recently is sort of why, like what is the motivation behind it, particularly in this space of history where the audiences can be not as large as potentially some other areas that you could go into for podcasting. So David, let's start with you. What was the motivation behind the show? How do you conceive of yourself or of the show as fitting into the history space?
Great question to start off with. The show's been around for 8 years, and 8 years ago, I had just started in my academic journey. I'd gotten my first work out of my PhD, and I was starting to listen to podcasts. I hadn't before then, and one of the sort of podcasts that really inspired me was Mike Duncan's History of Rome, which I'm sure a lot of people are aware of. And I thought, well, it's interesting that, I wonder if there's a Canadian version of this. And there really wasn't. I think at the time, I remember scouring podcast land, and I only remember one Canadian history podcast in existence at the time. And at the time, at that one, I felt I could bring something a bit different to it with my academic background. And so I decided, well, I would start my own, a narrative-based one, a bit more rooted in current scholarship and current research. So not sort of using outdated myths or outdated narratives, like something that was very current. And so that inspired me. And, the first couple seasons were touch and go learning experiences. But really at that time, I wanted to fill the history podcast space with something that was, legitimate in terms of where the research was coming from and where the information was coming from. And so I saw myself at the time as providing that academic background to it, still trying to make it palatable for the layperson, but rooted in academic research and scholarship that reflected current stuff. Now today, I'm certainly not the only one doing that. Craig does that, and other people do that. So there are other podcasts doing it now. So I wouldn't say I have such a niche anymore, but certainly that was the motivation in the beginning.
And Craig, what about you with your show coming in? One, the title is very clever. I very much enjoy it.
Yeah.
It's a very clever idea to use X in that way. But what was your motivation coming to your show?
Well, at the time, I was working as a journalist and I was a newspaper journalist. So I was kind of seeing the industry starting to kind of nosedive. And I was thinking, well, I got to find something else to do. And so I started freelance writing. And when I was freelance writing, I was listening to a lot of podcasts. And this was a few years ago. And there's still not a lot of Canadian content out there, especially when I first started listening way back in like 2010. If you wanted a history podcast, you had Rome, you had American history. There wasn't a lot of Canadian content. So I decided to start kind of making a podcast, and I started making it as a hobby and then part time. And then when the pandemic hit, I decided I'm just going to do this full time now. And so I did. But for me, I wanted to kind of bring a lot of the stories that you don't always hear from Canadian history. Growing up in Alberta, we had a very Western centric history. The Riel Rebellion or Riel Resistance, things like that. We didn't hear too much about Eastern Canada or much about in Indigenous or anything like that. So I want to bring more kind of Indigenous history and unique bits of our history apart from talking about Confederation or the big things, and have small town histories as well and things like that. So I could kind of fill that niche of the stories that you don't always hear in Canadian history, and that's just kind of where I started with it.
And Kathy, what about you? Your show, the '90s show, a little more recent than the other ones that we have here in terms of the origins of it. So what's the origin story for that, and your personal motivation to launch that show?
I launched it about 5 years ago as the history of just 1995. And I was looking specifically at one year that I felt was an important year because a lot of big things happened. But I was a reporter in the 90s, a radio reporter. And a lot of those stories had stayed with me that I had covered. And zoom ahead into the 2000s. I'm a big podcast listener as a former radio reporter. I love that medium. And I came across some old tapes that I had in a box from the Paul Bernardo trial, which I covered in the 90s. And it was just a treasure trove. And I thought, geez, what can I do with these tapes? Because I had forgotten that I had them. And they were all the tapes from all the media scrums I had done while covering the trial and different interviews and that sort of thing. And, put two and two together. And I was like, oh, I could do a podcast. And that was right around the time that Serial was out. So I thought, oh, I could do it in that type of format, retelling the trial. But then I thought, well, why not take it a step further and make it into not just a limited series, but something that could carry on. And so I did the history of 1995, and that was O.J. Simpson, the Oklahoma City bombing, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the Quebec referendum. So many big things happened that year, and eventually, 95 was starting to run out of ideas. So I expanded to the history of the 90s. And like you said, it's more modern. So initially, I didn't think of it as a history podcast. I thought maybe I was fitting into more of a current affairs type thing. But, the more I did it, the more I realized that it is a historical podcast, modern history, but does fit into that genre, I believe now. So people are starting to pick up on it that maybe didn't live through the 90s, so it is history to them.
Yeah. I know that I've taught courses where when I started, the first course I ever taught was 2011, and I could just say 9/11, and everyone's like, yeah, okay. Like, you don't, but now I can't just do that. I have to say, here's what
Yeah.
happened on 9/11. Here was the impact in the moment of it. Right. So it's just
Right.
that evolution. So yeah, so the 90s would certainly fit into that. But I'm curious for
Mhm.
both of you, Kathy and Craig, that your journalist backgrounds, your reporter backgrounds, how does that help you, do you think? And maybe Craig, start with you. How does that help you tell historical stories? Because you're so used to in the moment reporting, sort of minute by minute, if not day by day. How does that help you? How does that experience lead to telling a story from the past?
For me, I kind of started at the very bottom with like small town newspapers. So, and in those, you would be able to find the newspapers from decades ago. They always had them bound and kind of in a closet somewhere. And so I started going through those, and then I started writing the histories that I found in those into the newspaper. And I found a lot of people were very interested in that. These stories from the past that weren't grand stories. They were some goofy story. Like I'm doing an episode on Tabor, and I'm doing a segment about this guy with a wooden leg who caused this huge ruckus and was like beating people up with it. And it's just these stories that people want to read about in the past that they've completely forgot about, whether it's funny or tragic or whatever it might be. And so I kind of took that into making the podcast and writing about these stories that a lot of people don't know about, but that they would find interesting. There's a picture of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip sitting in lawn chairs because they went to a barbecue because their train stopped in Manitoba near this farm. Those kind of stories that are just so we don't hear about them, but they're funny and they're unique, and that's kind of what I want to do with the podcast. And then with my journalism background, because I did a lot of research, I wrote a lot of large stories and things like that. I was able to take that and apply it to what I do and be able to write a lot of content and make it interesting by kind of honing what I did with the small town stories that I was writing and seeing what people wanted to hear about, and then I can apply that eventually to making a podcast about Canadian history.
And Kathy, what about you? Is your experience similar to that?
Yeah, well, for me, I find that it kind of shows up in the way that I write each episode, like the traditional TikTok of, the chronology of an event is a way that I often look at writing the podcast. So, I can picture it in my mind like I'm telling the story to someone who's reading it or hearing it as a news story, and then fill it in with some of the more, the more colorful aspects that might not fit into a regular reported story. So that's one way. but another thing is like that I like to consider is the impact of these stories that I'm telling on the media during that time period. So I'm always interested, like that always plays into it. Like, how was this story covered in the media in the 90s? How was it treated? What, where was it popular? And how did it impact everyday lives through the media? So I think that, and I'm not sure if that's just because of it's comes from that era, or if that's my background being curious as to, well, what was the media doing? Because I was there, but like, what were other media doing, and how did it happen? So it's just an approach that I like to take with the episodes.
Well, and it strikes me too that for Kathy and Craig, your backgrounds, basically what you're describing is kind of what David and my background would be in academia, that just in a different format, right? You from the reporter
Yeah.
background, we go to as a student, grad student, go to archives, try to suss things out, find things, do that investigation, just in a different form.
Yeah.
David, I don't know, do you sort of, does that resonate with you when Craig and Kathy are talking about their backgrounds investigating and sort of the surrounding circumstances behind events? It strikes me that that's just historical methodology in a
Mhm.
different format.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to get to the truth of the matter, and we're accessing whatever materials we find are relevant to finding that truth. And in the historical sense, obviously it's traditionally archives, though that's changing now in history, and for the better. And for journalists, it's firsthand accounts, it's interviews, it's various other things that we might not always use in the deep, we might not even have access to in the historical. Certainly the 1990s versus the 1930s, the firsthand accounts are going to differ. But yeah, no, I think at the core, we're trying to get to the truth of the matter. It sounds like everybody seems to be on board of trying to find interesting stories from the past and trying to present them as contextually and factually as truthful as possible, while still connecting to the human side of all these stories, like Craig was talking about. The Queen and Prince Philip sitting in lawn chairs, right? These are very very intriguing pictures. I can't get that out of my head right now, to be perfectly honest.
Well, so that leads me to the question of style, because the three of you, stylistically, your shows are different from what I try to do. My motivation behind this show when I started it, when I think we recorded the first one in 2012, my motivation was just I want to talk to people. That was honest to God, that was my pitch to the people at Active History was, what if I just talked to people? The brilliant mind that I have of just talking to people. And the idea was, for me at least, I want to be like, I'm interested in history, but very specific topic that I study, and I want to talk to people outside of that. It's very rare that we've ever had anybody on the show who studies radio or even communications broadly, right? Because I want to talk to people who study things that I don't know about. I want to put myself, try to be like the audience member in that sense, and just ask questions that I hope the audience would want to ask or want to know. So that's sort of my approach to it. But you all go with a more narrative style, and sort of the research writing. So what was the decision behind that? Maybe Craig, I'll start with you, to go narrative. And what is the process of actually putting together the material to create the style that you want for your show?
I think for me, it came from journalism, and essentially I was writing stories for people to read. So I was kind of writing into the void, and occasionally you'd see somebody on the street reading your story and be like, "Oh, that's really great." You're kind of connecting with that person, and that kind of just worked for me. And so when I started doing the podcast, I thought I could have a co-host and things like that, but I kind of just want to tell these stories and tell them. I'm essentially talking to my dog, who's always in my office with me as I tell these stories. So he's kind of like my audience. And so that's kind of how I just started doing it. I'd write the whole script, and I try and stick to my script. I don't have a lot of deviation or anything like that from it, because I found that that just worked for me. And because I really like the research part of it. The irony is that with podcasting, the part that I dislike the most is actually the recording. I like the research and the writing and putting it together, and then I'll record it, and I'll record, say, a 40-minute episode, but it's 50 minutes because I have 10 minutes of me flubbing something, and I got to go through and I got to edit it and I got to fix it, and I got to listen to my voice 2 or 3 times running through these episodes. So That part I don't like. I like the writing and everything, but I enjoy what I do. I should, bookend it with that. But I just find it works well for me. I have kind of a very research analytical brain. I like to learn things and write about them. And the podcast was just an extension of that. I felt like that was the best way for me to take the passion that I have for Canadian history, the feeling that I have of, Canadian history is got a lot of good things in it, a lot of bad things, but we should embrace it and learn about it. And growing up, we didn't. It was a lot of American history, especially when I was in school, or very modern history like the Cold War. So I wanted to take my passion, and the best way to do that was to write it out and then just kind of talk into the void and hope that people enjoyed what I was putting out there.
And Kathy, what about you?
I call it documentary style. And I guess it is like a narrative nonfiction, but more documentary style, because what I do is drop in clips from people that I've interviewed for the episode. That I'll pull a clip, which is an old radio style, right? That I would report out a story, interview someone, and you drop a clip in, and so it's just an extended version of that. But also, because I'm with a network, Curious Cast, which is owned by Chorus, all the global radio and TV, I have access to their news library. So I'm able to ask them to check for any news clips from the time period that I'm covering, and I can drop those in as well. So it's a true, I think, audio documentary style. But again, a script, I write a script, don't deviate really from the script. And it's not always for everyone. Some people like conversational, some people like script when someone's reading a script, some people don't. So it's it's a little different than a lot of podcasts have two hosts that are talking, and that's very accessible, I think, for people to listen to. But there's I guess a style for everyone.
No question. And there's space for it too, which is great about this the podcast space too. David, what about you?
Yeah, much like Craig, I was more comfortable, I think, in making the script, in writing it first. I think one of the things that drove me in the narrative style was that I was my initial objective was to deliver content in a very formatted way. So I didn't want to leave dead space and I didn't, frankly, I was a bit lazy. I didn't want to go through editing stuff and trying to pick places that fell apart and didn't work. And I just was like, it would just be easier for me if I wrote the script out. And obviously, as a historian, I have a lot of experience in writing. Not necessarily, that doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily translate to writing for a listening audience all the time, but I had to work on that a little bit. But I just felt that I could deliver the episodes in the strongest fashion, the most bang for your buck, by writing the script and reading off it. I will say, though, in the last couple seasons, we've been starting to hybridize into blending interview episodes and narrative episodes. And I know that in the new year, Cool Canadian History is joined with a production company. And so I think we're going to be moving towards a blended format where probably two narratives to one interview, because I've started to enjoy the interviews myself, to be perfectly honest, and I find that certain times I get a lot more out of them than if I had done the research myself and written the script. So I think I know we'll be going to a more hybrid format in the new year, but certainly to begin with, the narrative felt like the most comfortable, most effective way to deliver the content in a sort of a listener friendly fashion.
Well, I guess that leads to another question too about the topics that you pick for your shows. For Craig, David, and myself, just title wise, we have maybe a little more flexibility than you do, Kathy, where you're kind of bound to the '90s, obviously.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I wanted to do, and I think we've done a pretty good job creating for this particular show, and with the website in general, and the things I do for Active History, is it can kind of be a catch-all. Like there's really nothing. I've only said no, I think, to 2 things that have been pitched to me. So I've been pretty lucky in that regard that I can pretty much say yes to most things that are of interest to me. But Kathy, maybe we'll start with you. How do you go about picking the topics for the show? And is there ever any conflict or worry that a topic might not fit the style or the tone of the show that you want to create?
Well, so far, obviously it's always 90s, but we're not specifically Canadian. We tell some Canadian stories, but we have told lots of stories that are either world stories or, a lot are focused in the US as well. So far there really hasn't been anything that, has been pitched to me, except um, someone suggested that I do, a lot of people have suggested the conflict in Ireland and the resolution of the Troubles in 1995, I believe, is when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And it is obviously an important story that happened in the 90s, but it feels like it's bigger than the 90s, obviously, and might not fit the format of our show, which is serious at times. But I think is also, it might not be as accessible as some of the other topics. Although we did try to tackle the Middle East with the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, which was also challenging. But yeah, so I think for me, it has to be something that has impacted a lot of people and that is still impacting us today. I think that's one of my more critical elements of picking a story. Is it something that we're still feeling the sort of the results of years later on us today, like the introduction of the internet as an example, and things like that.
Craig, you mentioned too that for you, good and bad at Canadian history is all there, but also maybe some of the smaller fun things that you can find in an archive. So how do you manage that that space?
Well, I have strict rules that I apply to the show. So like every Wednesday is small town history. So I look at a small town in Canada and I talk about its history, just because I find local histories to be some of the most interesting, and I want to get that out there. And it's really great for shares and things like that because then you get the town sending it out and everything. So that helps. But my main episodes are on Saturdays, and so I at least once a month I always have an Indigenous episode where I talk about something from Indigenous history. And then I usually just kind of pick things that I find interesting. My cutoff is about 1995, actually. I think the most recent thing that I've done is the Shawinigan handshake. So I think that was February 1995. So that would be the most recent thing. I don't do anything any closer to today after that. And whenever I have a month with 5 Saturdays, then I always do a nostalgia episode. So I'll talk about Mr. Dress Up or the Friendly Giant or the Beachcombers or Red Green Show, things like that. Just because I really like those things and I like to talk about them, and they're fun episodes to do. When I do Indigenous history or things like that, they can be often very downer episodes because there's a lot of things from Canadian history that aren't great. So I like kind of doing these happier episodes when I have 5 Saturdays. And then when I'm trying to pick things, it's just things that I find interesting. One reason that I started, all my other Canadian history podcasts was because I found I just couldn't fit them all into Canadian History X, or else I'd have episodes releasing, almost every day, and I don't want that. So when I was thinking, well, I really like political history, I put that into another podcast, and I like early hockey history, so I put that into a podcast. So I kind of split things up that way to kind of make it easier for myself and not to inundate people with uh, all the content that I want to put out. But for me, it's about picking things that I find interesting, because then I can take the passion that I have and the interest that I have, and I can, project that to the people that are listening.
And David, you have a season model for Cool Canadian History. Does that impact the topics at all? Did you try to create kind of a narrative through a season?
No, yeah, it impacts the topics in the sense that I want to find balance in the variety of ways that Canadian history can be approached. I'm a military historian by trade, so I try to avoid military history as much as possible because I could easily go down the rabbit hole of far too much. I know that like during the anniversary of the First World War, I had quite a few more military history episodes during those seasons as we sort of commemorated the 100 years. But generally what I do is I plan my season out in advance. It's bi-weekly. So every 2 weeks from September to the end of June, episodes come out, and I try to plan it before the season starts. So I have a whole list of potential topics, like 100, 200, 300 topics that keeps growing. And so I try to plan the whole season out before I go into the season. And so to make sure that I cover a wide variety of topics, from Indigenous history to women's history to queer history to labor history to different regions to media history and etc. So I try It doesn't always work, but I try to bring as much balance as possible so that in every season there is an episode or two for everyone, no matter what your inclination is regarding Canadian history. But then at the same time, things change, and events happen that are rooted in history. And sometimes if there's a current event that has a long, the statues, for instance, the John A. Macdonald statue coming down, residential schools, the recoveries of the mass graves, these things trigger a change in format. And then all of a sudden I feel it's important to address those topics. But generally speaking, I try to balance it amongst all the realms or the genres of history as much as possible.
Yeah. And that kind of leads us into the question too of audience, right? By trying to create that balance, something for everyone, which all of you have sort of mentioned in those answers. And I'll admit the audience for this show, as I conceived it in 2012 when I pitched it, was me. I was trying to create something that I would want to listen to. That is legitimately how I pitched it. Is I want to create something that I would want to listen to. And in the 190 whatever shows we've done, there's only been a few that I felt I haven't actually accomplished that for a variety of reasons. And you'll never get me to tell you which episodes I think those are. But it has happened a couple of times where there's been ones where I'm like, I don't think I would want to listen to that. But generally speaking, that has been my motivation. And so in terms of that's how I think of the audience is if it's going to be of interest to me, hopefully there are going to be other people out there in the world who find it interesting. So maybe David, because you mentioned, military historian, you don't want to go into military history because you can go down that rabbit hole. Maybe that could be a limiting factor for some audience members. So how do you conceive of the audience and how do you try to reach whatever your target audience is?
Well, I definitely conceive of the audience as an audience similar to myself, and I believe that all history is interesting. I really do. It sounds so cliched, but I truly do. There is rarely a historical topic, if well presented, that I wouldn't be fascinated with. And I believe that most people, most Canadians, if they listen to any sort of well presented topic, would find it interesting because it's part of our culture and the fabric of this country and the fabric of the peoples that live here. And so for me, there's really there's very rarely a topic that I won't cover. It's about time and space and expertise that really limits or focuses me on specific topics. If there's some good examples like Craig focusing on a lot of the small town history stuff, I often don't have access to a lot of small town sort of newspapers or information. I'm not even really familiar with researching small town history. So for me, that's sometimes a barrier for the way I might approach my episodes because I'm like a history of Tabor. I might be looking at as a historian going, I'm not sure where to start with all of this, right? And Craig has this sort of already extensive experience in doing that. So those are the things that really affect my just choices. And in terms of the audience, I think of my audience as a broad spectrum of people with a broad spectrum of interests who, I like to believe, whether naively or not, would be interested in anything that's well presented and connected to some sort of bigger idea of being in Canada or being or living in North America, etc.
Well, sort of that is interesting to think, Craig, too. Do you think when you do a small town episode, do you try to tailor it to that audience, to an audience from that specific location, or is everything kind of the same for you and your audience remains unchanged?
I try and make it so that my audience remains unchanged. I try and when I do the small town histories, I do want to talk to the people who live in those small towns because they can go, oh, that's what that building is, and that's that history of that building, or that's why that statue is there. But I also want to make it so that somebody who's listening to my podcast, who's on a road trip of Canada, goes, oh, Kindersley, Saskatchewan is actually I just saw a sign for that and there's some really cool things there, and they turn off the road and they go there and they check out the museums or whatever it might be there. So I could still try and make it as broad as possible because I think for especially if you're a Canadian podcaster writing about Canadian history, you got to try and hit as many things as you can because the interest in Canadian history drops off dramatically as soon as you get past the border. You still have people who do listen to it, but at least for me, my audience is Canadian living in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want to be able to hit as many different things so that you get as many of the people listening as possible. And that can be very difficult because some people are only interested in some things. Like I know full well that there are people who don't care about the small town history. They want to hear, about like Avro Arrow or things like that,
Yeah.
the bigger histories. And so you just got to be like, okay, well, that will be an episode, but I'm still going to talk about the small town history because there are people who are interested in that. They may be a small segment, but they'll be really interested in the content you're putting out. And so that's what I try and remember.
And Kathy, for you, you don't necessarily have the same geographic limitations potentially on audience, but you do have that very scary temporal situation that everyone who's ever done a history lecture worries about. That somebody in the back will put up their hand and be like, "Oh no, I lived through that. You got that wrong," right? Like, so you have that thing of, a good size of your audience will be people who lived through the '90s, while you'll also have audience members who did not live through the '90s. So that creates an interesting dynamic for you. And how does that potentially influence the way you think of your audience? Oh, Kathy, I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. My dog was
There.
barking, so I
Okay.
muted. There we
It's
are.
okay.
So initially, I thought, like you thought of the audience as being someone like myself or close to my age that had lived through the 90s and knew these stories. But as it turns out, podcast listeners are a little bit younger typically. So a lot of the times they were people who were very young in the 90s. And so they remember hearing about it. They would say, "Oh, I remember my parents talking about it, making me feel old." And then but they want to know more, so it's great that way. So I've kind of had to course correct a little bit because people have said, sometimes you refer to things as if we know what you're talking about, but we don't know what you're
Yeah.
talking about. So could you give a little explainer? And so that's definitely impacted it. But because it's all of the 90s too, though, I have to remember that there I've people have asked me to do episodes on wrestling and race car driving, and then there's people who are interested in the music and different kinds of music. So I think, David, that you said it too. You'd be interested in any historical story if it's told well. So that's my goal, is to get people to come along for the ride, even if it's not a topic they would necessarily be interested in. And people have said that, like, "Oh, I didn't think I would be interested in the X Files or whatever it is," and that was a really interesting story. I didn't know that about it. So I think once you build a listenership, they kind of trust you, and they trust that if you've picked it as a topic, that it must have some interest in it. So something interesting in it, and then they'll come along for the ride with you.
What was the feedback over the episode on the rave culture?
Oh, that was fun. There were a lot of people who recalled it vividly,
Sure.
that period. So they loved reminiscing about it. It was a really fun episode, actually, and a lot of people, it brought back a lot of memories for them, and people sent me pictures and
Yeah,
all kinds of
absolutely.
things that yeah, it was
I,
interesting.
I have to say, there's a tiny bit of nostalgia in my past life too, but we won't go too
Yeah.
deep into that.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because I always wonder what's the difference in my podcast between nostalgia and history. It's somewhere like, the two overlap and they're not necessarily the same thing, but I think,
They certainly
they
overlap.
both,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think they play into my podcast just because it's, like
Hmm.
you're saying, something that an era that most of the people listening have lived through.
Hmm.
Well, it's interesting too, Kathy. You mentioned that the audience will probably go along with you once you have a listenership. I remember talking with Sebastian Major from Our Fake History, which is another one that I do enjoy. And he talked about that the audience does have to trust you and you have to build that
Hmm.
trust over time. And part of that for him was acknowledging mistakes when there's a mistake that gets through
Yeah.
and just be honest. We got that wrong. Sorry. And just don't try to hide from that. And that's been something that I've tried to incorporate more in the show as well. And in terms of responding to the topics too, like, not going that there's a fear of going inside baseball sometimes because you're so enthusiastic about a topic,
Mm.
and that could potentially break some of that trust as well. So, what is that process like for you, Kathy? I'll start with you on this, because the idea of growing the show, growing the audience while maintaining that trust with the people who are already there, that strikes me as a balance that it can be hard to go, because you want to reference things or maybe call back or just really grow that relationship with the existing folks without making it unaccessible to other people who might be new to
Right.
the show, listening for the first time. So how do you try to maintain that balance in order to grow the audience?
Yeah, I think when it comes to, the biggest challenge is over explaining things, that for people that went through it. If you're over explaining it to the people who didn't go through it, I think it would be more offensive to those people that are getting over explained to, if you know what I mean. Because the person who didn't live through it, they can pause your podcast and Google it, or check it on Wikipedia or whatever. So I try to err towards not over explaining things, and not making it like a 101 on this topic. Like I'm hoping people come in with a little bit of knowledge about life, I guess, about the era and about the world around them, at least, and making the assumption that most of my listeners are in North America, but we do have listeners in Australia and in the UK. And I often worry about that, because I think, should I be doing stories from overseas as well? But it's something, I guess, at some point I may have to consider. Although, like, I mean, I did obviously like Princess Diana, but that's more of a world story, even though it's set in the UK.
And Craig, what about you? What's the growth strategy for you, and how do you balance out stuff that you might put on the other feeds versus the main feed of Canadian History X, and just trying to maintain the relationship with your various audiences that you would have in those different feeds?
I think, like with what Kathy said, I don't try and over explain things too much. I don't want to go into too much detail. Like, most of my scripts are, the episodes will be maybe 30, 40 minutes, but on average will be about 20 minutes. So I feel like I'm kind of like a Cole's Notes of Canadian history. Like, I'll talk about some big things in Canadian history, but I won't go super into detail. I'll talk about the more mainstream aspects of it, because I don't want people to. I feel like, if I'm speaking to somebody for 40 minutes at length, they're going to get bored and probably fall asleep. So I want to make it interesting but shorter, and not get too far into it. And then when I'm trying to, when I'm focusing on the audiences, the people who listen to From John to Justin are very interested in Canadian politics, and they'll listen to me talk about elections and prime ministers and such. Whereas in Canadian History X, I find they might not be as interested in that. So I try and make it more general history. And in Canadian History X, it isn't over. I'm not talking about too much. I'm kind of maybe glossing over a few things, but still getting to a lot of the interesting aspects of it. With certain things with Canadian History X, I like to kind of do what Kathy does with nostalgia. I mean, that's one reason why I really enjoy Kathy's show. The episode on The Simpsons was great. I mean, I grew up with The Simpsons. I've watched it dozens of times, so it was nice to listen to that and think back to watching it for the first time in the 90s. And so that's when I'm doing nostalgia episodes. That's what I'm trying to do with that, to peak that nostalgia aspect of it. And then with the other things, I mean, there's not a lot of people who are interested in early hockey history of the 1910s, 1920s, but I am. So I put that out there. I don't get a lot of views on it, but it's something I enjoy, and I think it's got a small but devoted audience who really enjoys it. Whereas if I put it in Canadian History X, I don't think a lot of people would be interested in it. So I just try and split things up like that, and just keep it as general as possible.
And David, you mentioned that you're going to have the hybrid model now. You're going to bring in more interviews. How are you planning on doing that without necessarily jarring the audience, or it's going to be new for your audience in that feed. So how do you manage that transition?
I mean, you just kind of do it, and you hope that people just enjoy it. I mean, I don't really want to manage my audience per se. I'd rather people just want to listen. They can listen, and I hope that I think Kathy had said earlier on that there's a lot of different formats that people prefer, and in my opinion, moving to a hybrid format actually increases the reach of the show as opposed to limits it, and I think that there's more space for people to listen to an expert talk about their work as opposed to me provide them with a script based on their research, and in some cases I think the narrative format is super effective, and in other cases I think the interview format is extremely effective. I did an interview with an expert on residential schools, and there was no question that had to be an interview. There was just no way that a white settler military historian was going to be able to appropriately tell a story about residential schools in what I felt would be a respectful and effective manner. So I chose to bring an interview on that. And there's other elements that it doesn't always have to be so deep and dark like that for the choice to be made. But at the end of the day, my hope is that my audience will find the the change, a nice change of pace and different opportunities to hear a different style and a different format presented, but still have the quality content that I hope that my show is known for. So hopefully the audience just knows that this is a effective way to go forward for the show.
Now, part of audience too is in one knowing the audience, and that goes not at just the individual sort of the demographic level, but also just numbers. And one of the things that I very rarely honestly look at is actually the numbers for this show. I find it tedious. I'm not overly interested in it. I look every couple months and see what the trend lines are, and I only look at the trend lines. I never look at individual shows, except if one like stands out for one reason. But it does lead me to wonder, because David, you mentioned you're bringing in a company. Kathy, you work with a company.
Mhm.
Craig, you say you do this full time. So the motivations for you all might be a little different than it is for me. And understanding the audience, potentially um, monetizing the space that you're in as well, if that's of interest, of course. But how do you try to then conceive of your show doing something that is genuine to you, that you are fully invested in and interested in, while also potentially navigating the monetization space and trying to maintain whatever relationships you have to build there? And Craig, let's start with you, because you're doing this full time
For me, I do pay a lot of attention to the numbers because I want to see what works and what doesn't, and by doing that, it's allowed me to kind of adjust my show somewhat. I did enjoy interviewing people and having them on the show and talking about whether it was their books or things like that. But I found, at least for my show, it was causing my audience to dip, and so. Even though these were really easy episodes for me to do because I didn't have to like write anything, I just had to talk and kind of ask questions and essentially learn. I found when I would go to my audience, I took a bit of a break in the summer and I said, let me know what you like, what you don't like. And I found that a lot of people were like, well, we don't really listen to your interviews. And it's like, okay, well, that's okay. So I kind of got rid of those. And I did find that my numbers had dipped each time I put an interview episode out. So I used the numbers to kind of um, focus what I'm talking about and what people find interesting. If I'm seeing that they're not interested in a certain way that I'm going, then I'll readjust that and go a different way. And then I use the numbers to go to people and say, hey, these are my numbers. Would you be interested in putting something into this podcast or sponsoring an episode or things like that? And so that's, for at least for me, the numbers are important. They can be depressing at times too when you're in a lull and you're like, what am I doing wrong? Why isn't this working? But like you said, you kind of look at the trend lines. If you look at individual episodes, sometimes you're like, well, that sucks. I put a lot of work into that. But if you look at the trend lines, and as long as it's essentially going up, then you're doing the right thing. And I take that and then I go to people and say, can you help keep me doing this on a regular basis, essentially?
Yeah. Like if you looked at all the episodes sort of after what, March, was it 15th, 2020? Like everyone tanked then, or at least as far as I know, everything I've read about it, certainly the shows that I'm involved with, tanked for like the first month of this thing. Just got crushed, and then slowly things have started to climb back. But yeah, so it's I find it very important when I look at the trend lines for sure. David, what about you? Now that you're bringing in a production company that you're going to be collaborative in that sense, how do you conceive of the numbers, and what pressures potentially are now brought in with that relationship?
I can be honest. I don't really pay much attention to the numbers. I look, every month, maybe I'll just like look and just, like I guess maybe the trend lines. I just see if they're growing, and if it's growing, I don't particularly pick apart the individual episodes. I don't. It's just not sort of a strategy that I've used in the show per se, for better or for worse. Perhaps part of it is that I'm not doing this full time, so the financial pressure on doing that is not as great. I have my job as a academic, but but with going on board with this company, starting the new year, and we're going to announce it all in the new year. There is that monetization aspect. That's the reason we're working together. And frankly, I'm all for monetization. The simple fact is, when I started doing this, I did this in my spare time. But, I have a full-time job. I have things I have to achieve in that job to maintain my professional standards, and this is on the side. And I'm 100% behind monetization of anyone's work, because I think this is hard work. And I think, right now, we live in a world where intellectual property is getting cheaper and cheaper, and it's getting stolen from us more and more. And I don't think there's anything wrong with someone putting their hard intellectual work into something and hoping and getting a salary from it. So I'm all for it, and whatever strategies that means, then I think it's well within anyone's. I think it's a positive thing in this media form.
Yeah, and Kathy, of course, you have the partnership
Mhm.
with an organization that does podcasting. So what
Mhm.
interest do they have in the numbers, and who manages potentially the numbers? Is that something that they oversee and that you have access to? Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I do have access. They oversee the distribution of the podcast, but I do have access to the numbers to see what we're doing. But they look after the selling of any ads and anything on that end. I provide content. They provide everything else, basically. And so it's not per se my issue, but I pay attention to the numbers, especially in the beginning, to see that we were growing, because you need to get to a certain point before you can start to monetize the podcast. So I was anxious to get there, and then once we got there, then I kind of stopped paying attention to the numbers quite as closely. And I've been interested to know which episodes people respond to more than others, but I haven't been able to tell that from the numbers. Always the numbers for every episode seem to be about the same, like within a couple thousand, right? But so I tend to look more at comments and feedback that I get from listeners to tell me whether or not an episode is something that people were responding well to or not. So as opposed to the numbers, because to be honest, the analytics are still kind of a mystery to me of how Apple and all of the different platforms come up with is it that how many subscribers you have, or how many downloads you have, how many listens, it gets a bit complicated.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, tedious to me to
Yeah.
try to conceive of all that. All I know is for sure is that there was one episode that I did early-ish in the run that I loved. I thought it was so interesting, and like nobody listened to it, and it made me frankly kind of laugh because it was out of all the ones that I had done to that point, it was the one I was the most excited to record. It was the one I had the most fun recording. I even enjoyed editing it because I'm like you, Craig. I hate editing, but I was so invested in it. And then I looked at the numbers like 2 weeks later, and it was just no one cared, and it made me sad. But like it also made me
Mhm.
laugh that like that one. And I understand why nobody was interested in it. It was kind of a dark topic, but anyway, it's sort of interesting though to try to make sense of the numbers because they can mean different things at different
Yeah.
times. No question. So, but at the same time, of course, the podcast space has very much changed since I started this almost 10 years ago, and certainly since all of you started your shows. There's literally like millions of shows out there. So, what is the podcast space to each of you? If you want to nail down specifically within the Canadian history space or just in general, like getting found is really the hardest part of any show. I mean, for as much as booking guests can be hard, or the editing, the recording, doing all the research, the writing, that pales in comparison to actually making sure somebody finds the show. Right? That is so hard. So how do you try to navigate just the overall podcast space, and then maybe specifically to the Canadian history podcast space, because it is so heavy, so many folks are out there trying to do it. And Craig, you're trying to do it with multiple shows.
With me, it's just trying to make content that people are going to find interesting and hope that it gets found. I mean, I've been lucky in many ways, being able to get, to front page of Apple, and that helps boost numbers and things like that. But I think in some ways with Canadian history, we're a bit luckier because there are a lot of Canadian history podcasts out there, but not like a huge amount. I have a couple of friends who do a podcast where it's the two of them talking about current events and things like that. And they've said that since the pandemic happened and all of these celebrities got together with their friends and started making podcasts of them talking to each other, their numbers have tanked. And because they dominate the you can't compete with Jason Bateman talking to his friends about Arrested Development or whatever it might be. There's nothing you can do about that. I mean, they've got the resources behind them. So I think with Canadian history, it might be a bit easier for us to get out there, but it's still hard. I mean, I try and put a lot of stuff on social media, and I do, on this day and things like that, just to try and build that audience, and then hope that audience translates to listening to an episode. Or if they, I put an episode on social media and they go, "Oh, that sounds interesting," and then they subscribe, and then maybe they keep listening. So I try and do that, and just try and get a wide variety of content out there, and hope that some of it sticks and some people find it interesting and keep listening, and then maybe share something and then tell their friends, and things like that. But it can be a grind. Some people are interested in Canadian history, and there's some Canadians who aren't, and they're interested in American history. And, you can't sometimes reach those people. So you got to have fun with what you're doing, and hope that your enjoyment of it translates into people enjoying it and then sharing it and continuing to listen and being longtime listeners.
Mhm. Yeah, very very well said, for sure. Thanks, Craig. David, what about you in terms of navigating that space? And I'd be curious too, like with the partnership too that you're entering into. How does that help you with the overall podcast space and trying to navigate all the finer things that Craig was talking about?
Well, I think I think the first thing, and Craig kind of touched on it. I think there's a certain level of, you kind of have to just put it out there and let it go. You can't really stress too much about it as much as we want to. You just have to hope. I always think of it in two terms: quality and consistency. If you only make 10 shows a year, make 10 shows a year every year for multiple years, and make sure that those 10 shows are high quality. And I believe that if you do that, there will be a space for you. I think what happens in the podcast world is so chaotic. There's nothing's vetted really beyond like sort of like language and things like that. That there's multiple podcasts out there on a variety of topics that are rooted in reading off Wikipedia and then recording it and submitting it to the world, right? So I think people do want quality, and I think people want consistency. And I think if you provide that in whatever topic you're dealing with, I think you will find a listenership. It doesn't matter what. Like Craig said, in the Canadian history realm, there's a limited space. There's a glass ceiling to it. There's only so much you're going to be able to do after a while, and that's that's the field we work in, right? I mean, we're just not going to appeal to tens of millions of Americans. It's just not going to happen. But that being said, that's okay. That's the choices we've made in this round. The partnership, my hope is that this partnership just expands the reach of it to other podcasts, and not just in terms of cool Canadian history, but in terms of my involvement in other podcasting realms as well. So this is also a personal media move as much as it is the podcast itself. And because I'm a military historian, there's other areas that I'm very interested in, media history as well, music history. These are topics that are very dear to my heart, and I lecture and write on them frequently. And so there's kind of this across promotional purposes that I'm hoping this partnership will be able to facilitate. But generally speaking, I do at the core of it, I think content and quality. People want to know that they can trust the content that's coming at them, and they want to know that it's consistent, and that they can rely on it. Whether it's 10 episodes a year, 40 episodes every Saturday, every Monday, what have you. I think that's a very important component of being able to reach as many people as possible.
And part of the trust too, right? The consistency and the quality that speaks to the trust element as well. And Kathy, for you not only have to navigate sort of maybe the podcast space, but also within the organization that you're part of. I'm sure there's factors in there of the different shows that exist within the organization. So how do you manage those relationships and try to figure out where you fit within the larger space?
Yeah, being with a podcast network has actually overall been great, because it does give me the opportunity to present the show to a larger market through their marketing department, but also to partner up with a host of one of our other podcasts, The Ongoing History of New Music, with Alan Cross, who has been in radio for over 30 years doing this show and has a successful podcast. But I was able to have him come on and talk to me about grunge music, because we did an episode on that. So it's great to be able to, do these crossover episodes with hosts from within our organization, because from everything that I've read and what I've heard, anecdotally, the best way to grow a podcast is by having your show mentioned on someone else's podcast, whether it be like a promo swap or an interview or whatever it is. It is definitely the best way to grow your show is to a captive audience hearing about it from the host of a show that they already like. So it's outside of everything else we've done. Like, we've run commercials on our radio stations, on our throughout the Chorus network, but I still think when my show is mentioned on someone else's show, it get a lot more pickup.
And that's why I'm sure everyone said yes when I reached out. Nice and easy. So I'm curious. I've had students do, I don't call them podcasts as assignments, but I have them do audio submissions for assignments, and it's been interesting to see. I've done it for the past 5 years or so, and when I started, I had to walk everyone through the audio editing process. Like, about 2/3 of the class stayed behind for a workshop on how to edit. Last time I did it, of a class of 25, I think 2 people stayed. So it's been interesting to me just to see that evolution of audio editing, that people seem to know how to do it as more people get involved, as the podcast space continues to grow. But I'm curious to ask each of you, would you advise a young person to start a history podcast? Is that something that, based on your experience, you would say to them, yeah, that's a good idea, you should invest your energy into this? And David, you work with young people, you're teaching them. What would your initial reaction to a student coming to you and saying, I think I want to start a history podcast? What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, I would say if that's something that they're really interested in, I think that's important. But boy, I mean, there's a lot of elements to it that I think it's a trial by error process. And on top of it, I think if you don't have the skills, and I speak to the journalist skills, the historical skills. I mean, there's a skill set to create quality content. There's a skill set to ensure that you're providing information that's presented in an appropriate manner. And I would say that if you're going to go into podcasting, you need to build those skill sets, be it if you become a journalist or go to journalist school or become a historian or what have you. I think there's a lot of building blocks that need to go in it before you deliver effective content. And on top of it, it's not a money making, it's not a very lucrative industry for those of us who are trying to do it independently. And if you have the time and you have the energy and it's a passion, then yeah, of course, pursue it. But be wary of the building blocks required to be successful at it. If what you want is success, if you just want to put stuff out there, then rock and roll, go ahead. But if you plan to create the best podcast or the best one in a specific topic, then there's a lot of building blocks and skill sets that need to be built up before I think that can effectively be done.
Yeah, and a lot of failure along the way too. I think that sort of goes along with that. But Kathy, what would your advice be to any young aspiring podcasters out there?
Again, I completely agree that I would ask them, what's the reason? Why are you doing it? Like, what are you hoping to get out of it? I had a friend who recently started a podcast, and that's exactly what I said to her, was like, well, what are you hoping to get out of it? If you're hoping to make a lot of money and instantly get a ton of listeners, then you're probably going into it for the wrong reasons, because it's a lot of work. It's a tough grind, and very hard to grow an audience. So you have to, again, like you were saying, that you have to be doing it because it's a passion. So if it's something that's a passion, I would say go for it. But it's also it's a way to build skills too, right? Like, that may translate into something else at some point in your career. It might be something you can point back to and say, well, I did host this podcast, and you definitely, even myself with a number of years of experience as a journalist and a writer, I feel like in the past 2 years, my writing has gone up another notch in terms of being able to write, for audio better than I had been even just a few years ago.
Yeah, I agree on that too. That the outside benefits of it are huge, and to me, monetarily, they can be huge too. I no one has confirmed this to me, but I'm convinced that I've gotten jobs because of the show, because I do the show. Like,
Interesting.
now the people will say, no, it's because of all this other stuff that was on your
Mm.
application. I'm like, no, I think it was because of this one thing, or at least it contributed to it. Like, it certainly helped
Yeah.
my case get certain jobs or contracts that I've done. So this show hasn't been monetized for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the relationship with Active History, which isn't monetized as an intentional choice by the website. So that, and I'm okay with that. But it has led to things like I haven't made money off the show, but I feel like it has been beneficial to me
Yeah.
from a monetary standpoint to do it.
Well, there's no
But
question that the podcast world is coming to the mainstream. I mean, I think in academics and I think in journalism, I think there, Serial is a great example. You mentioned that earlier, Kathy. I mean, that podcasting is not a fringe medium
No.
anymore, and podcast hosts are being taken seriously in their respective fields in whatever form that they're delivering it, and that's probably a reflection of that, because academics is so much slower than everyone else in accepting the new mediums, right?
Yeah.
But that's probably a reflection of the fact that even academics are now recognizing, and the academia is recognizing that these are legitimate forms of distributing knowledge, and these have to be embraced in some capacity.
Yeah. When I started the show, I was 3 years into the PhD, 2 or 3 years into the PhD, and every single faculty member I talked to said, "Don't do this. This is a waste of your time." And I'm very happy I ignored all of that advice, well-meaning advice, but I'm very glad that I ignored it, if I'm being totally honest. But Craig, do you have a different perspective on this? And if you had somebody come to you as the expert that you are in the space, what would you tell them?
I agree with both what Kathy and David said. If you're doing it because you love history and you just want to talk about it and write about it, then have at it and have fun with it. If you are going into it thinking, you're going to be hitting Joe Rogan numbers, well, you're probably not going to. And and if you do go into it and you're like, I want to make money off of it, then like what David said, you got to be consistent, and you got to put so much into this, and you got to continually improve your skills. And the first few times you listen to yourself recording, you might be like, oh, I just don't want to do this. You got to put out the best content that you can. Like it, for me, it's all day every day of doing this, and you got to make that commitment if you want it to make it something more than just a passion project, a hobby that you really enjoy. But if it is just a hobby for you, you just want to talk about something that interests you, then go for it, because you never know what's going to happen from it, and you'll improve as you go. Your first episodes might be horrible, but as you go and as you learn, they'll continually improve.
Yeah. If you're in the feed, if you're listening to this on the History Slam feed and you want to scroll back to episode 1, it's no good. It's terrible. And it's not the fault of the guest. It's totally my fault. It's Ian Milligan. He was great, but the show itself is not very good. But here we are 190 whatever later, and it's better now. And you sort of grow. And that was sort of my process, that I started it kind of as a hobby and almost as a challenge from the website in a sense, because I was sort of shooting my mouth off at a conference. That, hey, you guys should do something in the podcast space, and they're like, "Oh, you do it then." And this is how we ended up with it. But yeah, it's sort of it took a while to get into it and to get used to editing, to get used to my voice, to get used to all the mistakes that I was making on the show, and you just get better, you get more comfortable with it, and you kind of find what you want the show to be. The show now is different from what the show started as, in a lot of ways. I mean, the core tenet of me talking to people is the same, but it's changed and it's evolved, and I think it's better, and I have more fun doing it than I did back then. And so we continue to do it. So this has been so interesting to me to get all of your perspectives on your shows. So let's do some plugs, because Kathy said this is the best way to get people to find. We have a captive audience now. So let's go across. Kathy, where can people find History of the 90s and some of your other work if they want to catch up on what you're doing?
So, History of the 90s is available on all of the streaming platforms, and it's part of Curious Cast podcast network. So, their website is curiouscast.ca. And I'm on social media at that 90s podcast, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter as well. And I've just started a Substack newsletter. So it's history of the 90s.substack.com, I think. So something like that. History of the 90s podcast. This is bad that I don't know, but I literally just started it last week. So if you type in history of the 90s on Substack, it'll pop up.
All right, Craig, what about you? If people want to find not only Canadian History X, but all your other shows, where would you send them to?
Well, Canadian History X, From John to Justin, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War are on all podcast platforms. You can find them wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm on social media, Craig Baird, CraigBaird on Twitter, and then I'm on Instagram as Bairdo37. And if you don't want to listen to the podcast, but you want to read, then I've got all of the transcripts of every podcast episode I've ever done on my website. So there's about, I think we're coming up on 700 posts now about every possible thing you could think of under the Canadian rainbow. And that's just at CanadaEHX.com. And you'll find, you can listen to the episodes there as well on the posts, or you can read the posts and, become a patron and donate and all of that.
Yeah, and having the transcripts is good. I've heard from a lot of faculty members at schools across the country who want to use more podcasts, but can't because they're not all available in a written format with the transcripts. So it's great that you have those. So any faculty members who might be listening, go through Craig's catalog of stuff if you want to use podcasts, because the transcripts are available. So that's great to know. And David, what about you?
You can find Cool Canadian History on all podcast platforms. We're also on Instagram, Cool Canadian History, and I'm on Twitter at Doc Borys, at DocBorys. And if you're interested in my own personal research, I just had a book come out with McGill Queen's Press, which we did an episode on with you, Sean, Civilians at the Sharp End. And so if you're interested in an obscure branch of the Army during the Second World War dealing with civilian populations in war-torn areas, that book is for you. So check it out.
Yeah, check it out in the feed. Episode 180 something. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but yeah, go check that out. That was a fun conversation. Definitely check that out in the book. So Kathy Kenzora, David Borys, Craig Baird, thank you so much for doing this. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks.